hear about things going wrong, and often when things go wrong, in fact, every time when things go wrong, people are involved, whether they are good people or bad people. And so in addressing people becomes absolutely key in information security. We're going to hear from our speakers in a minute who will talk to us a little bit more about that. The other area that we tend to focus on, which is arguably probably absolutely key to human factor, but doesn't really come much in terms of the training awareness out of it, is identity and access management. So identity and access management becomes the front door. It is the entrance into the organization, but it's also around business process control and how the business functions within the context of information security to apply controls to reduce risk in terms of what people can do, what they can see, how they can access resources within the organization. So making sure that you apply roles correctly becomes absolutely key in that one. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more in terms of these elements as we go on today. We work with a lot of large organizations doing this. So just to give a bit of context with the kind of organizations that we talk to each other about. Yeah, so the human factor. When we think about it, people in terms of their first line of defense, when something goes wrong, if our people are there to help us understand that something's gone wrong, we have quick notification, quick incident management procedures. It means that we can do something about it. When our staff are responsive, it means that we can act. When our staff are not only not responsible, but also counterproductive to the agenda of cybersecurity within the organization, that can become a blocker or a issue in terms of incidents in the first place. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to make sure that we have things like good communication, good policy, good training, good awareness in place in an organization. And it's ultimately the reason why we do all of that stuff is because things go wrong. There's a massive increase in terms of state-sponsored threats. Artificial intelligence is being used in attacks. We have phishing and spear phishing coming up more and more in the fall. Just this morning there was an article in the news about a global syndicate who is being arrested and shut down, who are using spear phishing and phishing were now arrested. So that's shut down. But as many as we shut down, there are exponentially more that are doing it. So how do we get the right sort of controls in place? How do we get the right sort of things to address this critical issue? So we're going to hear a little bit more from our speakers now. And at the end of it, we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. We were supposed to have 3 speakers today. Unfortunately, one dropped out, so we only got 2. So we're going to start with Nahil. And Nahil, if you'd like to come forward and introduce yourself and tell us all about it.
Thanks, Dave.
Good. Thanks.
Afternoon, everyone. So my name's Nahil. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at USecure. So what we do at USecure is all around end user awareness. So our entire focus as an organization is on human risk management. So for the last 5.5 years, I've spent basically every day speaking with people about how to manage this element. What to understand about your employees, what to do to understand their vulnerabilities, and then how to mitigate that risk systematically to make it part of your standard processes. So it's important, first and foremost, to take stock of the extent of the problem. So 74% of all breaches involve the human element. So 3/4 of breaches that ever occur, at some point there has been a human being who in theory could have acted differently to mitigate that risk. So attackers understand that. Attackers know that human beings are the people who are less consistent, the people who have off days, people who just miss red flags, so they target them. So 36% of breaches involve phishing, which was 11% more than in 2022. Now, phishing isn't exactly a new threat. People have been aware about it basically as long as they've been using email for work purposes. So it's interesting how the percentage of breaches involving phishing keeps on going up. whereas it really should be reducing. This isn't a new threat, this isn't a new idea, but clearly we're not doing something to mitigate that risk properly. Clearly something is lacking in our processes with how we actually educate our staff members and make them resilient, which means they are now more vulnerable than ever, really. And the third point, which we're seeing more and more often, is compliance is becoming more crucial. So quite often, regulatory bodies respond to the threats that happen. They're often a few years behind. Now that we're seeing these threats and these attacks happen so frequently, things like ISO 27001 certification becoming much more common. Insurers are now more concerned about what you're doing with your end users. How well you're educating them, how you're tracking their knowledge levels, and also a lot of customers will want to know how you're going to handle their data before they work with you. So there's now more than ever more external pressure, external eyes on your processes to make sure that you're handling things in the correct way and that you have these programs in place. So what are the sort of main factors behind those statistics? Why are employees so vulnerable? The first one is, in my experience, the biggest one, is threats are evolving. The way in which people are being attacked, the way in which these phishing attacks are being crafted is evolving really quickly. David touched on spear phishing being a more prominent thing now. 4 or 5 years ago, people were concerned about spear phishing, but it wasn't that prominent. Now it is basically standard route for phishing attacks. One of the main reasons behind that is the increase of dark web material. When people hear the dark web, they often sort of think it's a bit abstract, it's a different stratosphere to what they operate in. The reality is the dark web is incredibly accessible. There are companies getting breached day in, day out, and the breach data that they get sort of taken from them is then posted online. It's put in data dump sites, put in paste bins, it's sold on the dark web because knowledge is power. When it comes to a phishing attack, when it comes to any sort of cyber attack, the more personalized, the more tailored an attacker makes it, the more likely you are to miss it, the more likely you are to get caught out by it. So effectively, more people are getting caught up in breaches, their passwords get leaked online, the services they use get leaked online, the security questions that they set get leaked. Attackers now have much more visibility about who you are as a person, and they can use that against you. We also find there's a lot of AI tooling, which means that previously building a spearfish was incredibly laborious. It would take a long time to build these types of attacks. Now there is AI tooling which allows you to collate that information in seconds. It can use email address and password combinations and run that combination against thousands of logins in seconds. So if you're reusing passwords, they can get access to your Teams channel if you've used that for something that's already been breached. What's linked with that is there is a lack of training. It's pretty consistent across a lot of organizations. They aren't effectively educating their staff members on how to use their work email, how to set a secure password, how to spot a phishing attack. A lot of organizations still do training in the way in which they were doing it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where it was maybe onboarding training. You get a PowerPoint presentation when you join. If you're lucky, you get reinforced a year later. But for the most part, it's a presentation, half an hour, there you go, you're IT savvy now. So that wasn't really working 4 or 5 years ago. People were still getting phished. So that chasm between the sophistication of the attacks and people's knowledge levels keeps growing year on year. And that's why we're seeing those percentages go up, 36% as opposed to 25% the previous year. The third point is a lack of process. One of the issues that we find in employee awareness with human risk is staff members know that their IT department has put in infrastructure. So they almost believe that because there's been so much work on infrastructure, there's no responsibility as an end user to be proactive. They think, I'm in my own environment, they put together antivirus for me, I don't really have to be responsible for anything that comes into my inbox. So if we can get processes in place that say to them, when you're working remotely, here's what you need to do to set up your remote working properly. When you set a password, here are the guidelines you need to follow in order to set a secure password. If we get these processes in place, you increase accountability with your staff members, they start to actually realize they have a part to play in it, and then you've got another layer of security as well. So in light of those statistics and sort of key underlying issues, how do you actually go about educating your employees? How do you actually go about flipping this on its head and turning them into an actual asset? It doesn't have to be anything super complicated. You don't have to make them technical whizzes. It's just getting them in the habit of engaging in secure ways. So the first one is make sure that you have complete coverage. We still see it sometimes where clients will say, we don't want to enroll senior management on a security awareness program because they don't have time to do training or don't have time to read policies. Or they maybe have 10 staff and they say, well, we don't want to sort of enroll these people on a program because they're only there for 3 months. They don't have access to too many systems, therefore they're not really a risk. Those are the people that get targeted because attackers know that you're likely to cut corners, and therefore they'll try and target senior management because of the data that they have, or they'll try and target those temp staff because they often get forgotten about. Your infrastructure when it comes to human risk is as weak as your weakest user. So anybody that has an email address and therefore could be infiltrated, they need to be part of the program. And again, that really then helps get buy-in. One of the main considerations when it comes to a human risk program is will people actually engage with it? If you get buy-in at senior management level and everybody knows the CEO is doing training, the CEO will then also filter down. That top-down approach will be crucial because then management will know, well, the CEO is going to press me about this. I need to make sure that my team are actually engaging. And then again, that helps contribute towards the overall culture of security. Step 2, make sure you have key training. It's absolutely vital. Training is one of those elements where people sometimes shy away from it because they don't want their staff members to get bored by it. And that's kind of an illustration of the sort of traditional issue with training. So when you look for a training program, if you're looking for your own internal processes, if you're looking for a third-party vendor, there's 2 key things to keep in mind. The first one is remember we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human risk. We need to understand that these aren't just names on a screen. These are actual people in front of a computer. So we need to understand each person's own individual profile. Cyber awareness and cyber threats is such a broad-ranging topic. It's not good enough to just send everybody the same program at the same time because you might have vulnerabilities for each individual user which you're not identifying and you're not then mitigating. So principle number 1, remember to treat each person as an individual. Principle number 2 is remember that the whole point of this is to actually change behavior. And the best way of changing behavior is through continual bite-sized reinforcement. Non-IT people will not sit down for an hour and do an IT training session. Or if they do, then it's just a tick box. Realistically, a few months later, they're probably reverting back to their usual habits. So the best way to actually enact change is keep the training courses short and send them semi-often. You'll get much better engagement with those training courses and people get in a habit. They get continual reinforcement. So that's absolutely crucial. Make sure it's personalized and make sure it's bite-sized and continue. Next step is make sure that you're scheduling phishing attacks. As we've seen earlier, it's still the main threat. It's still the main vector. If you get phishing attacks that your staff members have maybe reported, that's brilliant, but it's a bit of a luck of the dice. That phishing attack could have gone to somebody else and they might have actually given away their password. So speak to other people in your industry, understand what type of phishing attacks are going around, and replicate them in a safe environment. Figure out who has those vulnerabilities, figure out who needs that extra help. It's not a case of naming and shaming, it's a case of getting visibility, understanding those gaps and getting ahead of attackers before they use it against you. Next, make sure that you have key policies in place. So I mentioned this earlier about how auditors are now more prominent and about how it's important that your staff members know what's expected of them. Make sure that you have a central repository so that you have any documentation for IT or just general processes in place. So if you get audited, you can say, I have a secure passwords policy. Here it is. Make sure that you have a way of sending it to staff members so that they actually ask to opt in. Realistically, if you have a company handbook and it's on your intranet, when was the last time that you read that? So it's important that you're making sure that you have some sort of opt-in mechanism, making sure that you're reminding people about their responsibilities maybe annually or every 2 years. And that way, if you get audited, your back is completely covered. You show that you have those structures in place and those processes in place. Next, scan the dark web. So I mentioned earlier about how with spear phishing, it's much more targeted now because of the amount of data out there on people. The best thing that you can do is mimic the processes that attackers will use and get ahead of them. So scan the dark web, find this data, and if you know that your finance person is involved in multiple breaches and maybe their password's being leaked left, right, center, force a password reset, send them some training, send them a phishing simulation because you know they're a high-risk individual, and then you mitigate that risk before an attacker finds it. It's all about a race, basically, to try and make sure that this information isn't going to be used for malicious purposes. And finally, make sure that you get the reporting metrics that you need. It can be a bit overwhelming with human risk to understand what metrics are important, to have reference points to understand, well, is a 12% click rate bad for a phishing campaign if you've never run that before? Make sure that you know what key metrics you need and that you have easy ways to be kept in the loop about your progress. Again, it's all about finding those gaps in your organizational structure and minimizing it before they get exploited. And finally, again, this is literally what we do. We talk about this all day. So if you have any questions about best practices, maybe you have your own internal program, you want to improve the engagement, anything like that, if you're concerned about that human risk element in your organization, come and have a chat with us. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
It's a good afternoon. I want to start with a question. Your people, they're your greatest asset or your single source of cyber liability? Now, of course, that's rhetorical, and I can tell by your faces and smiles and laughter. I think we all know which side we sit on that coin, right? And equally, and I'm glad my previous presenter also referenced Verizon's DBIR, right? Again, a bit of a chronicle in our industry, with 74% of issues and incidents resulting from some sort of human element. I think that's down from about 8% last year. Progress? Questionable, right? Maybe reporting statistics. But again, what we can see consistently in the high-level macro data is that humans are involved, right? But what I want to do and spend perhaps the next 15, 20 minutes, I don't know how much I can stretch it, is delve into what are the components behind that, underneath it, right? What are the specific things we can take and look at to try and affect this number within our organizations? Because yes, we know human element is key. Yes, we know email is still the initial form of compromise to most organizations, depending on whose data you look at. Privilege escalation is then the next step, and ultimately some kind of data loss, ransom, etc. Usually that flows when we look at certainly e-crime-based attacks into organizations. Now, Verizon DBIR, like I say, is kind of where we can look at a lot of this data for our industry. And when you take what's behind that 74%, there's actually quite a number of different domains that it comes into. I've kind of consolidated those for the period of time to what we really see as kind of 4 key dimensions of human risk, right? Humans, obviously, we're big, we're complex, there's a lot to us. But when you break it down from a risk and how you can really affect risk, really comes down to these 4 things. Some of them you probably know, right? Threat risk, fairly self-explanatory. It's what's being presented to our end users, what's being targeted to them, how they interact with that. The impersonation risk, the use of your supply chain or even your own brand back into your organization. Data loss risk. Data loss and kind of insider threat is really, really one subject these days, because whether that's insiders trying to get data out, someone compromising a credential in order to exfiltrate data, it's all part of the same conversation. And then last, certainly no means least, we can't talk about human risk without bringing identity into the conversation. So let's break these down a bit further. Let's think about threat risk first and foremost. Now, if I asked you what are the types of threats coming to your end users, you might pick on some of these types of attacks that we're seeing. And certainly when I look at proof points data, and this, by the way, is data coming from our platform, which sits really high up the kill chain. So we're looking at what's coming into the organization. My slide OCD wouldn't let me put more than 2 verticals on here, but if you're interested in your own vertical, please come and have a chat with you or the team afterwards. We can get you some of that data. And whilst you can see, and apologies for those at the back, but roughly the colors match to credential phishing, the malware, the remote access trojans, to BEC, you can get an idea of the sort of volumes that organizations see. Now, I do this with a number of different clients, and absolutely credential phishing is by volume the largest thing that's going to come to your end user's inbox. Makes sense. There's a lot of credfish kits out there with little to no knowledge. I can go and stand one of those up, rent it on a daily, hour, monthly basis, and just constantly hit out to the internet to email domains, right? But they're not necessarily going to be sophisticated. Of course, when we go to the other end of the spectrum to business email compromise, or BEC, then absolutely what we're seeing is that much more targeted, much more effective, because it's much more bespoke. Now, the challenge we have as an industry is this thing called generative AI, which of course we all know and talk about. That has really removed some of the bars when you get into business email compromise, right? Whereas before, as an example, in Japan had both language but also business cultural barriers that for the threat actor were just too hard work to get right and to get, actually someone to engage with. Well, generative AI has absolutely removed that barrier to entry. You can now get very, very, well-crafted lures using social engineering for business email compromise in the right language with the right cues that the end user is going to be expecting. Unfortunately, we even saw very interesting risk in February. I don't know if you saw this in the news. $25 million was transferred externally for one organization out of Hong Kong to a threat actor, because unfortunately that individual had joined a call, a conference Zoom, I think it was, with their CFO and one other colleague, only to find out afterwards that that CFO and that other colleague weren't real. They were deep fakes using publicly available information of the CFO to then in turn instruct him to perform wire transfers to the sum of 25 million. Right? That's a threat I think we all talked around as vendors not that long ago was, oh, what could possibly come? And I know I myself felt a bit skeptical, but the realities of those unfortunately are here. So we need to think about that. But for me, the real aha moment in this comes when we move from a vertical, from an industry, from a what's typical to what's actually hitting our workforce, what is right for the individuals within our organization. So we need to think about individual risk, and how do we do that? So when we think about who represents risk to an organization, we have a Venn diagram approach, right, where we need to start thinking about the vulnerability of the individual. I used to do some work in vulnerability management a few years back. And of course, if a CVE came my way, I would learn to see is it exploitable in the wild? Does it have remote access or, capabilities to exploit remotely? Obviously, that would prioritize my list of view. We don't have that lens necessarily for human risk. But if we can start to understand the vulnerability of the individual, we could say, well, Alistair, has he taken his security awareness? If I took it, did I pass? Did I fail? That could be an interesting data point. Equally, if links coming through to my inbox, if I'm a serial clicker, so to speak, well, absolutely, I'm probably representing much more vulnerability to my organization than maybe someone who either doesn't read their email or certainly doesn't click the links that are presented. So when we start to gather some of these data points, we can get vulnerability insights to the end user. Next on from that, we can look at the attack spectrum. We all know that attacks vary greatly, like I say, from the kind of spray and pray fish kicks that are out there that are absolutely just volume-based, right through to the other end of the spectrum, which is those probably more BEC compromises, where it is either one-to-one or certainly one to only a couple of outboxes. Well, absolutely, understanding that spectrum of what's coming to a specific user is going to tell you a lot about that individual. And then last but not least, privilege. Do I have what the threat actors are after? I'm sure in all our organizations, we know the obvious ones: CFO, someone dealing with finance, systems administrator, domain admins. But what about from the business context, right? Who has keys to the kingdom and things or information that the threat actors would find useful? And once we can plot this out, we can really start to understand specifically where is the risk with individuals, not necessarily groups, departments, or the organization as a whole. And to back that up, I've actually pulled some anonymous data from a customer we worked with, where they ran this task. And for them, and this was a 20,000 seat organization, so a large organization, but 496 was actually the imminent and immediate risk from a user perspective that they faced. Because those individuals, when they plotted against this Venn diagram, had over 4.5x more risk based on some of the data points I talked around than any other peers within their organization. That's really insightful, because now we can now go ahead and mitigate risk directly where we're seeing it. But also we can then map onto that and let us back to those types of threats to see based on the individuals, and I would non-anonymize them by role rather than the names. But you can see quite clearly, if I'm a sysadmin, the threat actor is absolutely trying to get our box, right? They're trying to deploy malware, some kind of remote access. They want to be able to sit on their machine and understand what they can do from there. Very often at the top of this list, we see those shared mailboxes, information at, customer services. The threat actor knows there's probably a team of people sat behind them who are probably KPIs to interact with whatever comes their way on that email, to click the link, to open the attachment, to get to respond to the customer's query as quickly as they possibly can. Right? If you have one customer with KPI in that time frame, the threat actor probably knows this. So again, they're being targeted with credential phishing. And again, links that are trying to get access to their information, probably just trying to get back into the CRM or whatever kind of database holds that customer info. So again, the real interesting thing for us is once we can understand the risk they have, but also then what is coming to those individuals, guess what? Now we can start to affect it in a meaningful way. How do we do that? Glad you asked. So we think about this as obviously a constant evolution process. Luckily, my slide has managed to reverse an arrow there, but yeah, we move from assess to change behavior to be able to then evaluate, because of course this has to be a continuous thing. Again, I'm so glad we are starting as an industry to move away from, the the thinking of security awareness, the concept of making people aware of cyber, to actually cultures of security, and the fact that, again, that shouldn't be an annual task. That should be something we do continually. So again, how do we expand on that? Well, first off, if we want to assess our individuals, we need to assess them for what they do first and foremost. So again, phishing simulations are a great way to understand what will I do when presented with that link or that, urgent wire transfer that I need to make, right? So understand what I do, then understand what I know. Because if I'm really, IT savvy, I'm going to switch off really quickly when you send me something that I would consider 101 trade. So at which point that's not having the same effect. So if you can give me a knowledge assessment that helps me know, am I, relatively new to IT and cyber, or am I quite advanced? Well, guess what? Now we map on the right level of training for the individual based on the knowledge that they're starting with in the first place. Much more higher engagement comes off the back of that. And then last but not least, what do I believe, right? What's the culture behind my view of cyber? Is cyber important to the company, first and foremost, from my perspective, right? Maybe just because it's on a board memo somewhere or an annual report, what does that mean to me as an individual in the organization? But if you can understand from that culture, do I believe that it's important to the company, but is it important to me and my role? Obviously, that again gives us a very interesting lens. And then from that, we can start to move to changing behavior. And again, that change of behavior has to be this kind of nano micro training that is introduced at the point of the behavioral shift that we want to do. So as I click that link that's come on the phishing mail, that's where you're going to tell me a little bit about, phishing links, what that means to my organization, what that means to, to what could happen off the back of it. And again, we're going to make sure that that is targeted. If I can understand the threats that are coming towards me, why train me on something that I'm not seeing a threat to, right? If I'm only getting social engineering attacks for business email compromise, just train me on it. Even better, take the threat itself, de-weaponize it, and put it into my inbox now as a phishing simulation. Suddenly, I'm really, really close to what the threat actors are trying to do to me, based on my role and the opportunity that they see. So that's certainly, we can close the loop and get really effective. And of course, from that, we need to understand, and we can start to then drive that down in a meaningful way so that 496, whatever the number is for your org, starts to move down into something that we can show, we can quantify, and we can report back to senior management. Because again, that's one of the biggest problems we have when we think of human risk, is it's really abstract. So we need data points in order to be able to move forward. So that was threat risk. Moving on to the next domain, impersonation risk. These two are kind of hand in hand, but impersonation risk is such a big opportunity from the threat actor's perspective, kind of needs its own call out in my mind, because third-party suppliers, compromised accounts, is the a big play for threat actors today, because guess what? If I've got access to one of your suppliers and I'm thread hijacking, I'm using the right terminology, I'm using the right sending domain, passing DMARC, DKIM, and SPF, and all those other things, I'm straight into the inbox of you. So that's key. We run an annual report, by the way, if you're interested in some of these statistics, called State of the Fish. That came out just last month. And in there, we have a number of different telemetries around what we see is happening in the market. One of those, probably not that surprising to you, is Microsoft is the biggest brands that we see abused in that. What do I mean by that? Is, unfortunately, they're kind of the launch pad, but also the targets for a lot of these types of threats. So your end users, I'm sure you've probably seen them, will be getting the SharePoint, the Teams, you've been added to this channel, click this link, reset your password, all the Microsoft brand that's being used within those. But we really need to help our users understand and detect which ones are legitimate and which ones are those brand abuses. Now, as part of that, I do also want to talk a little bit about DMARC. I won't go too much into detail. I'm actually doing another talk in this afternoon session specifically on that and brand protection. So if you're interested, please come along to that. There's some interesting updates. But sadly, for DMARC, we're almost a decade, or over a decade now, into DMARC, the technical, capability. But if you look at the statistics, we're still quite a way away from really making use of what it could bring to bear in protecting our brand, but in protecting that impersonation risk, which is a real shame because, it can do a lot. And in fact, Google, Yahoo, and Apple have really, got fed up with this. And if you're not well ready, they've really said, if you're a bulk sender, i.e. your business is communicating with consumers, you have to do this now. It's not optional. You need demarked, you need low rates of spam, you need a number of other things, which we can talk about later, in order to be able to send through to Gmail, to Yahoo, and to Apple. If you don't, you're going to end up in a quarantine, or worse, you're just going to be not delivered at all. And again, to back that up, also just this, you might not see it at the back, but this is a graph showing an organization we work with who we got to Demark Project. I'm not suggesting getting to Demark Project is a simple thing, but it's definitely one you want to have someone support you through it, getting to that who's done it before. But it's so worth it, because look at this. So September 26th, this organization went to Demark Project. Within 30 days, the threat actor had given up using their brands, because of course part of Demark is to then report back those abuses and impersonations. So guess what? Organizations like Proofpoint, we then take that telemetry and we put a stop to any of those messages going out. So instantly we can start to see within a quarter that risk being removed. On from impersonation, data loss, I'm familiar this isn't necessarily a fun subject we all want to get into. I used to be a DLP consultant. My wife tells me that regex are things that's not a conversation for parties, but DLP, again, we've got some really interesting threats we've done. We've got one of the second largest platforms of its kind focused around DLP and insider threat. We just released our DLP landscape report. So if this is of interest to you, other statistics, go and grab it off our website. Again, who is the big risk here? It's careless users, right? Again, I think a lot of people think about data loss risk. I think about the malicious user context. It's still that well-meaning or, careless insider. Quite often this is I went to send to Alistair at company X, but I sent it to Alistair at company Y because guess what? Albert just gave me a drop down and I hit send before even thinking. So we really need to hone in and look in the different methods of data loss. That one in particular is one of the biggest, the ICOC. So again, if that's something of interest to you, there's some great technology. AI ML has really lent in to be able to help give feedback loops to end users of how they can mitigate that. Because as I say, a third of users have had that type of scenario. Sadly, I know I have. You're in a rush, you hit send, before you know it's too late, it's gone out. But alongside DLP, what we've really understood is that there are, for us, it's the types of users that you want to hone in on again, right? Of course, a number of these are self-explanatory. It's HR, it's finance. Those are absolutely where your key risks are to start with. But as you start moving down that, it's really those privileged users. It's those people who are in IT, maybe, either know the policy but do it anyway. We see a lot of that showing up in the data. So how you're going to affect and monitor them because they kind of think they know better or they're just doing it is going to be a key way to outcome. What we see is, key losses. This is based on things we've blocked going out. USB still top of the list. I think that's going to be there for quite a while. It certainly has been for the last few years. But the one that I think we're all worried about, the use of AI sites, what's being copy and pasted, put into those, absolutely has now come up that list and is now a top 5 entry. So again, being able to mitigate what's being put into LLMs by user communities who, again, don't necessarily see the risk that we do. How do we break it down? Well, if we want to break DLP down, again, I'm conscious it's a big, broad subject, but what we've really found in our experience is there are 15 types of patterns of behavior that lead up to an exfiltration or a loss, right? That's how I access the information, data harvesting, I'm pulling down from SharePoint, OneDrive, CRM, whatever it is, and gathering that information on my laptop, and then doing some kind of manipulation, breaking it down into small pieces. I'm encrypting, or I'm doing really malicious things like I'm changing file extensions, thinking that's going to be the way to get it out of the organization. But when we understand these steps, we can start to look for them. Because the problem with DLP is it's all been content driven up until this point. What we need as responders is context. Because if I'm working a SOC or an incident, and I see something go out, Alistair just did 10,000 file downloads off of our CRM database. Okay, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. I don't have that business context. But if I can see I did that, then I tried to encrypt it. Then I tried to push it out of the USB. That didn't work. Then I tried to hit it up to my own personal Dropbox site, downloaded and installed. Okay, now I've got a very different lens on what Alistair may or may not be trying to do with this data. So suddenly we can now increase policy based on the risk that we're seeing of the behavior I'm displaying. So again, really interesting shifts and increases in technology and how we can prevent some of these things. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll jump to identity risk. Now, identity is a big, broad subject, so I'm just going to focus in on one specific element, certainly that we see. Proof point, we're about trying to focus on where the risk, where we're seeing incidents. And for us, this, I think Gartner's coined the term identity detection threat response, ITDR, because we all have acronyms, is really focusing in on how are threat actors compromising accounts, and then using the breadcrumbs or the identity risk left behind within our organization. Again, we run a number of different assessments and publish this in reports. And what we found is that for all of the organizations we worked with, there was a 1 in 6. So every 1 in 6 endpoints had some kind of identity risk. What is that identity risk? Say an IT admin, picking on IT admins, but they connect to a machine, RDP it to a server, remote it to a server, cache passwords. An end user goes to connect to the CRM database, caches that within a web browser. All of that is identity risk that's then sat idle on that endpoint. So as that threat actor, through a phishing link, get access to that endpoint, they try and turn that illegitimate access to that legitimate access that's been cached on the machine. And of course, away they go, lateral movement, escalate privilege, and before you know it, they're looking to do whatever it was they were intending to do in the first place. So I really see why Gartner's come out with this in 22, beginning of 23, as a real focus area for CISO security teams, because whilst we have the greatness of privileged access account management, we have MFA, we have these defense capabilities, unfortunately the threat actor is still finding that path through it by being able to use these cache credentials in order to escalate privilege and move through. So with that, again, I'd like to think and ask you, how are your user community? Are they your asset? Are they your vulnerability? And if they are still your vulnerability in your view, what plans have you got in 24 to be able to, A, quantify the risk that around some of these domains we've talked around today? Once you've quantified it, how are you going to be able to then move that down, shift forwards? And then the one marketing side, I just say, myself, the Proofpoint team are downstairs. If you'd like to help quantify some of that for yourselves, come and have a chat with us. We'd love to show you how we can do that. Thank you very much for your time.
Can I ask you to please join me up front? It is time for Q&A. So if anybody has a burning question and you put your hand up and ask us nice and clearly your question. Yes.
If goal was to minimize risk event research, what could be a good idea? Obviously, one anything interesting was to sit in. So what would be a good idea to make a station yourself? Rebuilding the cat of risk and what the risk are. So we're using things like TikTok, Instagram, and everything where AI is a huge but now was really now that we're awareness of we're more out there and how it's that on medias.
Yeah. And that's part of the issue is that people they use it as part of their day-to-day life, but like you say, never get told how to do so securely. So yeah, it's a constant challenge to try and keep on top of those latest risks and the latest, trends for how people are potentially using work online or socially online, because that can still get used against them. So we use a lot of AI tooling ourselves to build courses very quickly. So if we see, we work with a lot of schools, and naturally they tend to get targeted a lot. So if we find that they're finding that their students are a bit more vulnerable because of X, Y, Z, we then build training courses designed for that. It's always a case of making sure that you're not going to bombard them, pour them with stuff, basically giving them very practical advice that they're actually going to understand and apply because it's got real life scenarios for them to relate to.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I'd say, yeah, you've got to make it relevant, you've got to make it real, and whatever lands for that individual. So again, yeah, making sure that content, again, depending on the individual, is more geared to do them, but to your point, you're bringing them into understanding it. It's a societal issue. Yes, they need to have responsibility based on not affecting the school, the organisation that they're in, but it's a societal problem, and therefore understanding that context really can open their eyes. Training's important, all the rest of it. Engagement, though, I mean, one of the most successful things we did with one organisation was just doing something like this, kind of having a bit of a speed dating. They asked the users to walk around the room, make sure they get a stat from each of the tables to then get a view. We just pulled up, the pwned database and asked random people for their email address. And for some people that blew their mind, right? The fact that I could relay back to them, we tried to blur some of them, what their passwords were. Why would someone care about me, right? But again, you're making it real, so yeah, very frank.
To be able to. So, earlier you talked about pulling it microtraining and decided to small mass training is very helpful. what's your recommendation on that? Be having that to 3 months, over 6 months, or like 4 months? Like, is there an example?
It can change organization to organization. We usually recommend going monthly. So I think if you make your training add up to around 2 hours across the year, that's probably the right element to sort of get the right amount of data out there, the right amount of information, but not bombard them. So if you do 10 minutes of training, 20 minutes training per month, that then very quickly adds up. So yeah, the majority of our customers go for monthly. Some start off a quarterly and then maybe amp it up over time. It depends on your culture around it. You know, if people aren't used to that type of training, if they aren't used to having that sort of focus on them, then you don't want to scare them off. You need to get them in the habit of engaging with it and then maybe amp it up over time.
Just a big follow-up question on that regarding efficiency of power and backwards and that I can convert brains as a college as out of tea.
Coming in 10 hats.
And would that be considered a form of the training?
Yeah, I think Alistair touched on it as well about.
Yeah, so I think, I think we would, so just to follow on another question, so I think, yeah, really interesting point, agree with it. I think at the same time also, if you're failing, i.e. you're taking that training, you're not, taking the quizzes as part of that, quick one questions, yeah, maybe you're going to get targeted with a bit more training versus some of your peers, right? So I think there's also then you have to, again, it takes more time and effort, but make sure that you're following individuals' paths in learning as well as, by team and by organisation. To answer your question on the phishing, yeah, again, what I would say is for a lot of customers we work with, it is probably weekly, but what they're doing is, again, doing different teams, different organisations, because certainly a lot of organisations start off with that one we're going to push out to everybody. But guess what? The first person who gets it sits and says to their peers, if you get this email, don't click on it, whatever you do, right? So again, making sure that we are getting the content in the fish as well as the training more specifically to them, certainly where platforms can help, so you're not having to do all of that legwork yourself, because appreciate that is a lot of work. Even just to do one to everybody is a lot. So yeah, I mean, again, depends where you're at, depends on how quickly you want to move it. But if you have regulation that's driving some of that as well as to how regularly you would do it, because again, it's a fine balance, as you say, between, not having to do that versus doing it. All I say is, try working at a company that does phishing for a living. Nobody can get us to click a link, no matter what they want. It depends on your organisation.
I think one of my takeaways from listening to both of you is that it's not just about the training. Training is absolutely key, and there's no question about it, and the frequency of training is important. But we mustn't forget that there's also a plethora of controls that we can have in place in terms of communication, in terms of things like DMARC, having a good UBA in place for monitoring of privileged use compromise, having things like the endpoint detect respond capability that allow us to be able to drive out a more comprehensive systems-based solution. So there's technologies, there's people in physical training, there's a lot of communication that also needs to come into it. So having a balance and looking at the spread to address the human risk is actually key.
Yeah. And how do we get to the next stage in this? In the context of that, weekly awareness training, doing how channel teams setting out information about cybersecurity constantly, doing simulations. It is cyber level is from yourself is the known phrase in the organisation. Yes, I did a simulation last week, and 20% of the users all an attachment, which drove me mad. What's how bad is that percentage? How do I get to the next stage of that?
Sure.
It's vital training. It's weekly. We are going weekly, and I'm available. It's still not enough. This is a weekly IT savvy organisation.
How are you finding their engagement with the weekly training?
Very, very good.
Yeah, it's impressive. There we go. Very impressive. So those attachments are sort of a new route which are putting a lot of pressure on. So it's just becoming more common. That's often a way in which attackers will get in. So it's part of our sort of whole process trying to evolve what we have available in the system to actually map out to what you're expecting. So there is training in the system dedicated for that exact scenario. So we see that happen a lot. We see a lot of deep fakes, like was mentioned on the video conferencing stuff. So we have dedicated sessions for that, because phishing awareness in general is really important, but it's segmented into so many different sort of micro elements of phishing that you need to make sure people are aware about those different specifics to look out for. So it's basically a case of that continual process, and ultimately you're never going to get the risk down to zero. It's kind of accepting that as long as you're being proactive and that you are doing everything you can to identify that in your safe environment like you are. As long as they're engaged with the training off the back of it, and you may be setting a test in a month or so, if they still have that percentage, then we have a problem.
So let's just continue the app.
Essentially, yeah, and then we're finding doing more things around more aggressive dark web monitoring. So, you know, finding that sort of data more progressively before attacks used against you. Make sure that you're building that culture, as David mentioned, sort of a more holistic approach whereby there's that onus on the end user that they know they have their own responsibilities. You know, it's not just a case of just doing training and it's ticked off and it's done. You have the policies around it, you have this sort of culture that's being talked about regularly. It then starts to sort of morph and you get those percentages down.
Just to add on to that, I'd also add, like, try, if you're able, find a positive metric. So who's reporting, right? Because to your point, I can sense something probably that if you know the organisation well enough, especially being inside, you can get pretty high click rate, right? You do it at the right time, it's payroll, it's something super emotive, you will. For us, it's also down what's reported, because click is one, but reporting is really the culture and the behavioural shift we want to see. So yeah, try and add that to balance your view so that you are seeing the progress.
Yeah. I think also when we look at people changing their very behaviour and their behaviour, it becomes something that takes time to actually get it in place. One of the things that is also very useful is if you understand those people within the organisation that are particularly vulnerable to attack. Because one thing that is really true is that the malicious actors out there are constantly trying to change the way that they attack in order to be able to get through. Because if we've seen it several times before, we will educate and people will know about it. It is what people don't know about. It's what people don't suspect. So part of training should include targeted and situational awareness to individuals that are particularly vulnerable to significant compromise. So your citizens, your people, your BBAs, who have access to the data. If you target them and help them to get situational awareness, they can start to see patterns of attack where the attack is actually inevitable. And that's where you can be inevitable. Any more questions at the back?
I believe there are regulations coming in the next couple of months from parish councils. Can you discuss those a little bit more? We're all, anything big ones, ops or IT, know that we have the issue of there's always here to find fast training, just won't be aware of what T10s. But now it's back in the business. That's really I mean, that yes, with fakes users. When it's long, it's a door.
Are you guys aware of the Irish regulations?
Not the upcoming one of some asked.
Is anybody else in the audience aware of the Irish regulations that we're not? Just. And the after I get this the hard didn't minutes.
So it's like here
Coward middle with an environment.
Well, there's a challenge.
Yeah, straight onto content there, yeah.
All right. Was yourself, yeah?
A bit different question, and I don't quite believe the answer. But you were talking about mitigation with the Level 3, the Euro platforms, all that, and but the Level 3 open, so and a bigger reason why I'm asking the concept of the bylaw scores. And I'm going to say, recently I discovered something incredible. I wanted to send a judge to my colleague. And see what that means. So in the future, still what that means. Then I did it would be interesting to see this kind of evidence we should have learned how. Would that be something that
Yeah, I mean, we don't always name it publicly how deep we go in an archive, as in an archive within an archive within an archive, because threat actors do that as well. So yes, we would look down through that. Equally, applications over email is screams malicious content. So I know some organizations, it's part of how they just do business. So we appreciate that standard. But if you're going to whitelist that, you've really got to get quite specific on it, like a firewall, right? You really are laying only that and everything else is blocked by policy. But yes, going deep within an archive, looking at the behavior of the files it pulls out. Obviously yours isn't a malicious context, but if you flip that around and it was a malicious file, we need to look at the behavior. The days of looking at it just based on a signature, it can be useful from a performance perspective, but it's absolutely not the be all and end all. We need to look at behavior and then make determinations. But yeah.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so Q&A is over, but if you would like to have a conversation with any of our speakers, do please come up, have a chat, or find them on the floor. Thank you very much for your time.